right, let's get started. This is our first plenary of 8. We have 8 plenaries, which is fantastic, and that's
amazing. Yeah,
it's pretty good. And we're so pleased that our first plenary speaker is Willy Renandya. He works in the National Institute of Education and Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. He is a good friend of TESOL. We've seen him speak many times, and we're happy to have him back, always happy to have him back. He is one of the most familiar faces in ELT in Asia, I think. He is always online. You can find him on Facebook at Teacher Voices Professional Development, a very great and supportive and
almost every day
of people. Yeah, he posts. You can find him on, I believe it's Willy's Corner. Is that right, Willy?
His Teacher Voices. Willy's Corner is a website.
Is your website is
yes.
Willy's Corner, all1string.com. You can find him there. You can find him on Discord. You can find him. He's everywhere.
He's everywhere. Scary.
That is about all I'm going to say about him. I'm going to let him get started. He's going to talk about addressing the reading writing gap in second language learning. Willy, whenever you're ready.
Yes, I'm ready, Michael. Thank you so much, TESOL. Thank you so much, Michael, for having me again at TESOL this year. Ladies and gentlemen, my presentation today is about addressing the reading writing gap in second language learning. I don't know how many of you watched the keynote yesterday. Gerd Leonhard is just amazing. He's a futurist. I am not, simply because my future predictions is wrong most of the time. So I would refer to myself as a presentist. And as a presentist, I'm going to talk about, things that are of immediate concern to many of you, to me, and many other teachers out there. I'm going to be talking about the connection between reading and writing. In particular, I'll be looking at the how we can strengthen to make the connection between reading and writing even stronger. And that to me is very important. If we are able to do that, I think we'll be able to use reading as a springboard to developing students' writing. Now that is the key takeaways of my presentation today. So reading, how reading can lead to writing. Let me explain. But before I do that, let me just, share with you some of my favorite questions that I usually ask to teachers. Of the 4 skills of reading, listening, speaking, and writing, are they equally challenging for your students, Michael?
No.
No. Some are more challenging. Yeah, some are more challenging than others. I think when I ask you the second question, whether productive skills are generally more challenging than receptive skills, then I think you will probably say yes. Yes, Michael? Please don't say no.
Yes.
Yes.
Now that I'm unmuted, you can actually hear me.
Okay, I can hear you, yeah. Now, the third question is the focus of my discussion today. The most difficult skill is, Michael, back to you again. Please say writing.
Well, out of the 4 skills?
Yes, out of the 4 skills, yes.
For my students, it would be speaking.
For your students, it will be speaking, but for many other people in the audience and many other people out there, not in the audience, I think speaking, yes, is difficult, but writing is probably the most difficult. Now, here is the reasons why I am saying that writing is often the most difficult skill. Every year, I screen through, review a lot of applications for admission into my university's graduate programs, and this is what I often see. Overall IELTS score is 7, but the individual scores on the 4 skills vary quite a bit. I think you can guess the first one is probably the one of the receptive skills of maybe reading or listening, and the other 2, speaking and writing. This is what it usually looks like. Yeah, and very often, although the overall average score is 7, the writing score is very often below 7, and that is often the reason why the application is not successful or is rejected by the university. In most graduate programs, I think writing is a very extremely important skill, and students will need to be able to show evidence of their writing ability before they can undertake a graduate level program that requires a lot of writing a thesis, writing a dissertation, and things like that. Okay, Michael, let's work with me. Why is writing difficult? I know your favorite topic is speaking, but today let's focus on writing. Why is writing difficult? Yes.
For my students, it's because they take it in very, very small chunks, and they try to translate from Korean. They translate word by word. Instead of translating the idea. So end up with these very phenomenally long, complicated, and sometimes horribly awkward sentences. Because they're overthinking
Yes. I think what you're saying is students often have this problem of translating ideas that they may have a lot of ideas, but getting it translated into acceptable language, acceptable piece of writing can be very challenging. What I have here is some that I've seen from the literature and also from my experience teaching reading and also writing and other language skills. Speaking is relatively easier. I'm not saying it's very easy, it's relatively easier because speech is very often context dependent. And very often people can depend on facial expressions, body language in order to understand what the other person is saying. And even sometimes without the person saying anything, we can make sense. We can understand what the person is trying to say. But in writing, you can't. Now try writing an email message without any text in it. I think nobody will be able to understand what you're trying to say. Writing is context independent. In other words, you have to say almost everything that you want to say to help the recipient or the readers to understand what they're trying to say. The structure is often quite rigid. I'm referring to academic type of writing, serious type of writing. The structure is quite rigid. If you don't follow the structure, then you'll get into big trouble. The teachers will not be very happy if you send your paper to a journal editor, for example, and if you don't follow the conventional structure and organization, then chances are your paper will be almost immediately rejected. Text signals are very, very often very important for writers. They have to make use of these text signals in order to guide the readers so that they can follow your train of thoughts. Things like first, second, third, in conclusion, in addition to, these are words that are important, words that we don't usually use very often on a daily social interaction. The language tends to be formal as well. And also the standard variety of language is used in academic piece of writing. So instead of using look at, people use examine, explore, investigate. Instead of put up with, you use words like tolerate. We use both tolerate and put up with, but I think more often we use put up with than compared to tolerate in a casual conversation. There are other factors that make writing be longer and more complex. And also in academic writing, you need to think about very carefully about the content, about the structure. The language may be good. If the content is not good, then the chances students will not be able to get a very high score on their assignment. And finally, this is something that you can relate to. I can relate to it as well. Writing is slow, writing is laborious, and mentally taxing. Okay. So essentially, writing is difficult. Writing is difficult for you. Writing is difficult for me. Writing is difficult for your students. Writing is difficult for everyone. It's probably one of the most cognitively demanding language skills. But the good news is this. The good news is reading is connected to writing. Reading tends to be easier And we can use that as a basis for developing students' writing skill. Yeah, so this is one of the main arguments that I'm going to put forward to share with you today. Reading is related to writing, and we can use reading as a springboard to developing writing. Let's look at the connection very briefly. Yes, we know that they are closely related. We also know that if you can't write, if you can't read, if your students can't read very well, chances are they can write very well as well. Yeah, so the connection is obvious. And good writers are usually good readers. Is that correct, Michael? This is good writers are good readers.
I would hope so.
Yes, I would say so as well. Now, this is probably true. If you write well, that only means that you have done a lot of reading and your reading is very good. But the other way around is probably not true. Good readers are good writers. Maybe yes, maybe no, but I think the answer is not always. Now, this is very interesting. I've been working with in-service years, and whenever I to them that, hey, get your students to read more, writing will improve. There's always some of them will say, yes, I have some of my, I have in my class, they read a lot, they're avid readers. Is horrible, their writing doesn't improve as much. So what is the problem? Now here is a problem. They're similar, but they're not the same. From a mental perspective, from a cognitive perspective, reading involves comprehension, and comprehension involves a lot of semantic processing. Understanding for meaning, basically, processing ideas. Now, this tends to be easier, not very easy, but easier. Writing, on the other hand, just a bit like speaking, requires a lot more syntactic processing. I think Michael was saying earlier on, this is how ideas that you have, ideas that students have, will need to be translated. Now, the translation process requires stronger syntactic knowledge and also rhetorical knowledge and also lexical knowledge. So that is what makes writing especially challenging for most of your students. In other words, receptive knowledge does not automatically translate to productive knowledge. Okay, again, they're similar but not identical. Now, here is a nice quote from two researchers. They're very well-known researchers, Fitzgerald and Shanahan. Very interesting for us to look at and reflect on. If reading and writing were really identical, not just similar, then everything learned in one would automatically transfer to the other. And that is not the case, yeah? So reading and writing are related, but the relationship is not one-to-one. Now, at this point, let me introduce you to two models, two pedagogical models that have been proposed in the literature. The first one is known as a direct model. The direct model is very interesting. Now, one big who has been promoting the direct model is this guy, Stephen Krashen. Yeah. This is what he said some years back. When enough reading is done, all the necessary grammatical structures and discourse rules for writing will automatically be presented to the writer in sufficient quantity. And for many years, he's been arguing that this is enough. If the students do this, if they do enough reading and the quality of reading is also good, then chances are you'll be able to develop, very good student writers. But many people have argued against this, saying that, yes, but that's not enough. I think we need something else. We need a pedagogical model. We need some kind of intervention, if you like, to help the students to see the connection between reading and writing. The connection is not direct. And this is where I'm going to share with you the indirect model, which I will call the Willy's model. Michael, please take note of that. Willy's model, the Willy's indirect model. Yes, Willy's model.
Okay.
The indirect model. Okay, for any pedagogical model, I think we will need to consider a few things. we will need to consider at least 4 things here. Now, these are 4 things that I will be sharing with you. For any pedagogical model to work, I think you need to consider, number 1, what theory of language will we be using? And number 2, what theory of language learning will we be depending on or relying on? And number 3, what's the role of the teacher? And number 4, what is the role of the students? So these are 4 things that I will be sharing with you very soon. The first one, I think you have seen a lot of theories of language and you have used some of them in your teaching as well. I think you have seen the structural model, you have seen the functional model, and today I'm going to focus more on the functional model, and in particular, what has been called the genre model for teaching writing, or for teaching language, if you like. It's often called the text type model, the text model for teaching language or for teaching writing. The idea is that a text is always produced in the context of a communication. There has to be a purpose, there has to be an audience, and the context will have to be very clear as well. I'm going to explain what this model is like a little bit later, but for now, in terms of the theory of language, I'll be using the genre-based model of language teaching or the teaching of writing. The theories of learning. I know there are many theories out there, and many of the theories may be applicable in today's discussion, but I will be focusing mainly on 2 theories. The first one is the input theory. I think you have heard about the input theory, that comprehension is important, optimal input is important for students to develop their overall language proficiency. Number 2, no less important, is the noticing theory. Basically, in language learning, if you focus mostly on comprehension, you'll be missing a lot of the finer, the important language features. So Schmidt, for example, suggested that we need to help the students to notice important features, important vocabulary, important grammatical features, important rhetorical organizations, so that the students might be able to use this later when they speak or when they write. Number 3 is teacher's role. The teacher's role is to make use of an approach that connects reading, writing, and noticing. Now, this is what I referred to earlier on as the genre-based pedagogy. Now, this model, or this approach, if you like, has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 components, and I'm going to go through them one at a time. The first one is modeling. The second one is deconstructing. This is where noticing can happen. Number 3 is joint construction, independent construction, and finally, focused feedback. Yeah, let me just look at the first one. The first one is where reading can be more tightly, strongly connected to writing. Modeling. Usually in our writing class, when we teach writing, the first thing you want to do, or you usually do with your students, is to engage students in an idea generation activity, brainstorming activities. Students spend 5 minutes discussing with your friends or with your classmates, talking about the contents, planning your piece of writing and things like that. But what I'm suggesting here is that simple ideation activity is good, but it's not enough. I think students will need to see a lot of ideas. The students will need to see a lot of ideas and how these ideas are associated to specific language features. Now, this is where we need to bring in multiple texts. Students will need to read the kind of texts, not just 1, maybe 2, maybe 3, maybe 4, maybe 5, the kind of text that they'll be writing, and they'll be expected to be able to write like those model texts. Let me quote a very interesting idea here from a book called On Writing Well. This is not a very academic book, but I think the idea is super interesting. And the author has been able to sell like 1 million copies. Michael, isn't that our dream? To be able to sell 1 million copies of books? And then we can retire early, yeah?
No, my goal is just to reach one single student.
Okay. Michael, let me ask you to read this. People, I think you need to look at this very carefully. I think the guy is really good in summarizing one of the most important pedagogical ideas that I've seen in my life. Michael, please read this for me.
Writing is learned by imitation. If anyone asked me how I learned to write, I'd say I learned by reading the men and women who were doing the kind of writing I wanted to do and trying to figure out how they did it.
Yes, I think the guy nailed it without using any technical jargons. In other words, read and read and read, but it's not any kind of reading, but focused type of reading. I know some of you may be, may not like the idea of imitation, but essentially that is what beginning students, beginning writers do. They do a lot of imitation, and eventually, slowly and gradually, they'll be able to develop their own style of writing. Yeah, for that to happen, they need to read and read and read and do a lot of focused and targeted reading. And they should also be paying attention to the way these writers, wrote their ideas on their papers or books. So that's the first one, modeling, yeah? So the modeling bit is where you provide a lot of language input, a lot of reading materials for the students to look at, for the students to appreciate. Very, very important first step. Simple idea generation is not enough, I don't think. Point number 2 is where focus noticing can happen here. Again, this is the teacher's job to highlight, to show the students, hey, this is what the text that you'll be producing. Pay attention to some of the most important features, rhetorical language features and other features that are available, that are present in the text. For example, if you're teaching a piece of narrative, for example, you might want to begin by highlighting the typical organizational structures of a piece of narrative. Usually there's an orientation, there's complication, there's some resolution. And along with that, you may want to highlight some. The keyword here is some, not all of them at the same time, because that will result in total chaos or confusion. Some of the typical language features, the kind of tenses that are usually associated with narrative texts and things like that. Yeah. So first one is modeling. The second one is deconstructing or deconstruction. The third one is joint construction. This is the stage where the students are not ready yet to write on their own. I think this is a very, very important step from a pedagogical perspective. Joint construction is where the students receive a lot of guidance, the students receive a lot of help from the teachers before they can write independently on their own. Teachers can provide a scaffold like this, a writing frame, if you like, or with younger kids, the teachers can actually do the writing himself or herself with ideas, with the content contributed by the students in the classroom. So that is another form of modeling that you can do in the classroom, yeah? And finally, the next step is independent construction. Once the students are fully aware of what they're expected to do, a lot of guidance has been provided, then they're ready basically to write on their own. Now, this is where the process writing can be embedded. And finally, feedback. Now, this is an extremely important element in our teaching, whether you teach writing or speaking or any other forms of language skills. The key word to remember is focused feedback. The idea is very simple. Students can't pay attention to every single mistake that you corrected. Yeah. So providing extensive feedback is not likely to help. I think what we need to do is to provide focused and targeted feedback to the students. Again, in the context of genre-based teaching, the feedback will have to be related back to the language features, text features that you taught earlier on. You focus on that alone. And occasionally, of course, you want to provide minimal or no feedback at all. Okay, now essentially the teacher's role again, involves 5 major steps: the modeling, the deconstruction, the joint construction, the independent construction, and focus feedback. I think this approach is likely to help you and your students to see the connection between reading and writing more clearly. The next one, a very important role of the student. So what do students need to do? 2 things. They need to read more. They need to write more. It's obvious, isn't it? If they want to enjoy the benefit of reading and writing, then they have to do both more frequently. The idea basically, is a reflection of what we have already know, that practice makes perfect. But more important than that, we need to encourage students to do 2 types of activities. They need to do what has been called writerly reading and readerly writing. Now, don't get confused now. Writerly reading is this: read like a writer. Because if you just read like a reader, what you get is comprehension. You understand what the content is all about. But if you read like a writer, chances are you'll be able to notice and remember some of the language features that you will be using in your own writing. Yeah. So writerly reading is reading like a writer. This is what I do. And I'm sure this is what Michael does when he wants to write a piece of paper on speaking or on any other aspects of language teaching. Readerly writing is writing like a reader. Now, this often happens after you have done your first draft. Never submit your first draft. Your first draft is always horrible. What you need to do is to look at it and put yourself in the perspective of a reader. And this is how you can develop greater audience awareness. Your first draft is terrible. Your first draft is not very clear because you're writing for yourself. But the second draft will have to be focused more on what the readers are able to get from your piece of writing. So here again, Willy's indirect model. There are 4 major components. You need to have a theory of language. You need to have a theory of language learning. You need to, empower the teacher to make use of a pedagogy that connects reading and writing. And finally, the students will have to play a very important role as well. Okay, so what is next? Now, this is the big questions. Does the indirect model, or will the indirect model solve the writing problem? Can I hear from you, please, all of you? Yes or no? Can you put it in your chat box just to keep you busy?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, hearing. Yes.
Yes. Michael, yes, no?
Yeah, yes.
Yeah, okay, good, yes. I would say yes, mostly yes, but not enough. Not enough for academic writing. Not enough for academic writing. Let me just say this very briefly. And this is one of the reasons why universities require that graduate students show evidence of their writing ability or their overall proficiency at a certain level of proficiency. Academic writing, I think a certain threshold of proficiency will be required. Otherwise, students will continue to struggle. I think I'm referring to this threshold. For serious writing, I think students will need to have reached a B2 or a C1 level, and that is roughly about 7. When they have reached that level, I think writing can be easier. Writing with some help from the teachers can be more successful. Now, the key thing, this is my last point, the key thing is how do we cross the threshold? How do we get the students to B1 or C1, a B2 or C1 on CFR? I think we need to turn to people who have been around longer than us. Now, these are some of the people that you have seen I think most of you know Paul Nation and Alan Maley and Kristin Nuttall and some other people there, Richard Day, Krashen, and also Willy Renandya. They will tell you that if you want to get your students to reach that level of proficiency, you need this. Michael, how good is your Korean?
It's not as good as it should be, according to my wife.
Yes, can you read that?
Tado.
Yeah, very good. Daduk. Yes, Daduk is extensive reading. So that is what you can do to help the students to reach that level of proficiency. And that level of proficiency will be needed if you want the students to be able to read at the higher level, the more serious type of writing. Here is a more solid quote, if you like, from a book written by Hedgecock and Ferris. Let me read this for you. Rarely in language education do we find a teaching approach that is so universally hailed as beneficial, important, and necessary, yet is so underutilized and even ignored. And what is that language approach? What is that teaching approach? There you go. That's the one. It's called extensive reading. And the big guy behind this approach is Richard Day. And this is what he says. Good things happen to students who read and listen. I added that. A great deal in the foreign language. Research studies show very convincingly, if you ask me, they become better and more confident readers. They write better, their listening and speaking abilities improve, and their vocabularies also become richer. If you need something more substantial, here are two meta-analysis studies, a summary of previously done studies on extensive reading, and these two major publications show that the effect size is between 0.46 and 0.57. Remember, it's not a super powerful, but I think it will get your students to that level of proficiency, which I referred to earlier as being in the B2 or maybe on a C1 level. And if you look around, if you ask your students, especially those who are doing well in your classroom, I think they will tell you something very, very similar. And here is an example of a teacher from Vietnam. She's an avid reader. And when I met her about 2 or 3 years ago, she told me that she was able to reach IELTS 8.5. That was super high for most teachers or for most students from EFL countries like Vietnam or Korea. And what struck me was what she said to me when I asked her what makes reading important to her. And she says, reading makes reading easier. Reading makes writing also easier. Ladies and gentlemen, if you've been wondering how you can add a strong, extensive reading component in your program, now here is a reading program, a digital library called XReading, developed by a former English language professors from Japan. What's the name again, Michael? I think you know this guy. What's the name again?
Goldberg.
Yes, exactly.
Aaron Goldberg. Right?
Yes.
Aaron Goldberg?
Yes, Goldberg, yeah. So this is a wonderful library because students will be able to get access to more than 1,000, Paul Goldberg, 1,000 graded readers. And the system also allows the teachers to track students' reading progress, to assess their understanding, and to guide student selections. And you can also assign activities depending on students' interests, depending on students' ability level, and things like that. I think it's a wonderful program. So the gap is now filled, if you ask me, theoretically speaking. I think you need to find out for yourself whether this actually works. And can I suggest if you are working on your doctorate or master's, this is probably a topic that is worth further exploration. I would strongly recommend that you look at this topic very carefully. In conclusion, I've discussed with you, I've shared with you how we can strengthen the link between reading and writing. And point number 2, I shared also with you 2 models, the direct model and the indirect model. I think they need to go hand in hand. We can't just depend on the first model, the direct model. We also need to, be familiar with the indirect models using the best pedagogical approaches that you can think of in order to help the students to build the gap, to bridge the gap between reading and writing. Yeah. And finally, another piece of implication is this. In your program, I think it makes a lot of sense to integrate the teaching of reading and writing in a single course. Don't separate them. I think it makes a lot of sense to mix them together or to blend them together. And another important implication is this: a reading teacher should also be a writing teacher. And finally, now here is a small gift for you. Willy's ELT Corner. I think you can view, you can download a lot of very useful ELT materials completely free for you. Ladies and gentlemen, and that's the end of my presentation. Michael, thank you very much.
Wow, thank you, Willy. Free stuff. I really like that.
Free stuff.
I think that's my wife's influence on me. She loves free stuff.
Free stuff.
I think at this point we'll open up the floor and see if other people have questions for Willy. I've got a couple, but I would rather let you all do the work for me. Or oh no, wait. I'd rather let you all go first because I'm so polite.
Yes.
So if you have a question, just unmute yourself and cough gently or say hello and ask Willy your question. James, did I see your hand is up, James?
Yeah. Hey,
Yeah,
Willy.
James. Hi, James.
You mentioned the direct and indirect models, and you've been to a number of places here throughout Southeast Asia and probably world as well. Do you find that one model is used more than the other in given like development of a country and or other development of the ESL, EFL programs within that country?
If you ask me, my observation has been that in many EFL situations, students usually are not that successful in developing a basic proficiency, working knowledge of the language. I think the first thing we need to do is to expose students to provide a lot of interesting, comprehensible materials, which is basically what Krashen is saying. Give students a lot of language input, give students a lot of direct exposure to the language. And if you do that, I think we'll be able to see a lot of interesting language learning outcomes in our students. At that level of working proficiency, if you want to take the students one step higher, I think intervention becomes very important. Teacher intervention, basically teaching, becomes very important. I think students need a lot of guidance. Students need to be able to see how what they have seen in reading, in written text, and in oral text can then be used to develop their proficiency further.
I see Carlene Blackburn has her virtual hand up. Thank you, Carlene, for being awesome. Just unmute yourself and ask Willy your question.
Yes, hi. Thank you for the presentation. That was awesome, sir. My question is, I usually teach young learners, and young learners, you have to chunk things very small.
Yeah.
So there was a time during a winter camp that I actually modeled what my elementary school teacher did. Was she said, before you start anything, I just want you to write for 5 seconds or 2 minutes, just anything that comes to your mind.
Yeah.
By the end of the week, coupling that with a very simple story starter and using like little emoji pictures like dragons and bunnies and things, it really lowered the threshold for
agree.
kids to wanted to write more because they felt
Yes.
more comfortable.
Yes.
And then by time I saw them during the year, they weren't saying, oh, writing, because now they've been comfortable with coming up with their own ideas. Because I figured out that kids can't really form anything just yet.
Yeah.
You can't tell them a whole lot of things.
Agree.
But if you
Yes.
open up that imagination, it really did help.
Yes. What you said reminds me of an approach to teaching young children known as language experience approach. In this approach, basically what we do is we take students to see actually, for example, the zoo or many other places so that they can have real world ideas that they can bring to the classroom. And later in class, they write together with the teachers. I think what you said is very much similar to that approach, giving students the experience, the direct experience of looking how things are out there, and then bring those ideas into the classroom. They may not be able to write, on their own yet, and this is where the teachers will need to provide maybe sentence starters or even an approach called dictated writing, if you like.
Right.
Dictated writing is a very useful approach where the teachers mostly do the writing and the ideas generated by the students. Now, having said that, the way I see writing is this. There are two types of writing. Writing for fun, writing for basically general language development. I would call that, extensive writing, if you like. Writing just for the sake of writing, like writing a diary, writing for yourself. And then the other one, which I focus more on in my presentation, is basically intensive writing. The kind of writing that is challenging, the kind of writing that is usually expected of our students if they want to pass the big examination. And the kind of writing that we all need to do if we want to get ourselves published in a journal. And that kind of writing is tough, that kind of writing is challenging. But the other type of writing should be fun. And I fully agree with young children. Language learning should be pleasurable. Language learning should be a lot of fun. Carlin, thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Is that what you look like?
No, it's 9:44 p.m. here on the East Coast in Virginia. So
in Virginia.
That is actually what she looks like. She's just
so I'm a little tired.
Shy.
Yes, I think Jessamine raised her hand. No, sorry.
Willy, I had a question, and actually, yes. I have a problem that maybe you can help me with. My students, all of this is good. You want them to do a lot of reading, you want them to do a lot of writing. How do we deal with time? How do we organize our time to get that done? Because I find, my students, we have to spend a lot of time just doing remedial mechanical things, like writing a simple sentence with proper punctuation. And then I get them to read things and they don't want to, they're supposed to practice writing. And I'm supposed to take them from where they are up to an academic essay at the end of a 15 semester. What are your suggestions for how to organize our time?
Yes, I understand fully what you just asked, Michael. And this is an issue, this is a concern that many teachers in the world actually have. We are limited, time is so limited. One pedagogical solution will be for us to consider two types of learning. One is intramural learning that happens in the classroom. The other one is extramural learning that happens outside the classroom. In the past few years, a lot of people have been investigating the potential impact of extramural learning on language acquisition, on language learning. Now, I'm bringing this because there's no way we can have sufficient time, enough time to help the students to go from one level to the next level. We'll have to depend on what is available, what is out there for the students to enjoy, for the students to take benefit from. It's an ideal situation. I know it's not easy, but what we can do is to add a stronger dose of motivation in the classroom. Let me give you an example. When you teach reading, for example, typically you start with the reading passage. Maybe you talk about the reading passage together with your students, and at the end of it, you end with a set of reading comprehension questions. And that's the end of the lesson. What I'm suggesting is that maybe we can pick their interest. Maybe we can get them excited about finding out things that are not very clear from the reading passage, things that will get them excited to do more reading. What I'm suggesting is that if our pedagogy is based on the idea that a reading lesson should not end with a reading comprehension questions, but a reading lesson should end with more potential reading. I think that is one way to go. And the key word is motivation. Or more recently, people use a very exciting term. It's called self-determined learning. And I think I can see that our job, one of our most important jobs, is to get the students to be excited about learning. And when they're excited, I think they will take it one step further and also spend time on their own. We are too focused on teaching the skills, but we are not done a good job yet. I must say this because I've not done a good job as well. We are teaching the skill, we are focusing on the skill, we are forgetting that language learning, any kind of learning, depends on two other dimensions of learning. The first one is the will. Have you done your job? Have you done a good job in motivating your students further? And number three, the thrill. Isn't that wonderful, Michael? These three words rhyme actually. The skill, the will, and the thrill. Very, very important. I think we need to work together. We need to find ways to get the students to be really, really excited about learning. And when they're excited, when they feel the thrill of the challenge, and when they receive sufficient support from the teachers, I think they will take it one step further. They will go beyond, they will do the extra mile, basically, to acquire, the language more efficiently and more effectively.
Okay, thank you. Gerald, I see you have your hand up.
Sorry, yes. Wrong answer there.
Couple quick questions. So how do you know if your students are at B2 or C1? Because all these tests, TOEFL, TOEIC, IELTS, they don't follow I don't understand how people can use that as an equivalency. How does that work?
Interesting. I've seen some, some academic work comparing a number of different tests, and at the end of the exercise, basically they are able to roughly estimate that a B2 C1 is like 7. I think you can Google it and be able to find a lot of information about that. It's a rough estimate. It's not exactly the same because TOEFL is very academic, isn't it? It's an academic proficiency test. CFR, on the other hand, is more general. So I don't think there's a perfect match between CFR and TOEFL, but roughly,
sure,
that's where they're at. Yeah.
And just another thing, you're talking about extensive reading. I mean, even at TESOL, people have been making presentations on that for 15 years.
Yes.
We used to have a SIG for TESOL.
Yes.
And the big problem now, as it was 15 years ago, is very difficult to implement because in Korea, usually the person in charge of the English program is total amateur and knows nothing about teaching English.
True.
And the experts are down at the bottom of the hierarchy with very little influence. And I can't use extensive reading in my job because the university,
you'll get into trouble if you do.
Pick the book and they say you can't do extensive reading.
Yes, yes, it's interesting. It's interesting that extensive reading is very, very popular and widely implemented in Japan. I don't know if Japan is very different or similar to Korea, but they've been very successful. One of the reasons is that a number of extensive reading people, if you like, extensive reading guides, they seem to, congregate in Japan. I can mention some names like Rob Waring, for example, and Mark Helgeson, and then Tom Robb. Now, these are people who are really dedicated, who are really excited about, about reading and the importance of extensive reading in helping students develop their English language proficiency. The Extensive Reading Foundation was also is headquartered in Japan, and they have a number of SIG, extensive reading on SFG. So for some reasons, the ideas basically thrive in Japan. So I would suggest, Gerald, that we organize a symposium on extensive reading, and more importantly, invite administrators or school leaders or university leaders to attend. I think they need to see the results. They need to see the benefits. They need to see the impact of extensive reading on language development. Which reminds me, I recently published a paper in JASID. JASID is JASID Journal, and the title of the paper is Top 10 Reasons Why People Are Not Doing Extensive Reading. I can send it to you. In that paper, I also mentioned why school leaders, administrators are not excited about extensive reading. They want to see results. And people in academia usually are not very good at, communicating results that count, results that are important from the perspective of these people. So
well, thank you.
I'll be happy to send it to you.
I see Brian has his hand up.
This is a quick response to Gerald as well. I found that I teach at Handup Global University in Pohang, and in one of our lower courses, the writing expectations for students were paragraphs, kind of academic paragraphs with a topic sentence and supporting points and a conclusion. But what we were showing them, and this was true up until a couple of years ago, what we were showing them were either fairly long essays or general reading in which those paragraphs were not actually, so there were no models. We were showing them one thing. It was like a magician's trick. We show them one thing and we expect something else, except the magic doesn't happen that way. So one thing that we can do is make sure that whatever the writing expectations are for the course, that should be the driving focus of whatever reading is done. Whether it's extensive reading or limited reading or focused reading, it's the writing expectations. And that's something that we've been really working on at this university, is making sure that what we show our students is the same as what we expect from our students in each level of our program. And that's been a significant shift, which I can tell you experientially, it's starting to produce good results. And Willy, we're also doing that specific noticing that you talked about here, where we take a look at some of the paragraphs and say, this is a good paragraph because of these reasons, and this is what I want you to put into your writing. And it comes across as being a little bit formulaic.
Yeah.
So later this afternoon, I'm going to be talking about student voice, because it's very easy to lose the student voice in all of this formulaic mechanical. And I think that's a problem we now need to turn to.
Yeah, good point, Brian. Reminds me of the idea behind formulaic language. Now, it's interesting because research shows that the language that we use, the language that we produce in speaking and writing, mostly formulaic. So I don't see anything wrong with that. But copying is not good, But initial copying to me is okay. Imitation is okay initially. But gradually, I think the students will have to learn how to express themselves using their own language. But that comes a bit later, after they have seen a lot of good sample or model text. Brian, can I just make a quick comment on paragraph writing? I think paragraph writing is okay, but I think we should, slowly and gradually move away from paragraph writing and pay more attention to the idea behind text-based writing or genre-based writing, because that is more meaningful, that's more communicative. The text always has a purpose. The text always has an audience. the text always a very clear context and also structure.
In
Singapore, for example, every single teacher knows the PACC. P is purpose, A is audience, C is context, the other C is culture. It's been drilled upon them that when you teach language, you need to always focus on these four things: purpose, audience, culture, and context, because that is how language is used. Yes, Brian, sorry.
We have a 4-level program, and this in part was done. We focus on paragraphs in the first 2 levels so that we can address Michael's concern of how do I get students from from 0 to 60 in 1 semester, and we've decided that at our university we can't take them up to an essay in 1 semester. So we focus on paragraphs in levels 1 and 2, and then after that we build on those to get to an essay in the 3rd and a report in the 4th level of our program.
Yeah, good idea. Yeah.
All right, Brian, I don't know, I've never met you. You sound smart. Can you come and convince my administrator to do this, because they don't seem to listen to me. Great talk, Willy. Great interaction, everybody. I think we've, wow, fantastic first plenary. If the rest of them are at this level, it's going to be awesome sauce level. So visit Willy at Willy's Corner, join him on Facebook, and me, I'm in there on Teacher Voices. We're going to have to end the session now, but please do go over to Discord and keep talking about this, and go have lunch. And Carlene, you go to sleep because it's past your bedtime. All right. Thank you, everyone. We'll see you this afternoon or whenever.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate your questions.